You know this. The problem is not notes, scales or arpeggios, but all your solos still sound bad. And this is surprisingly easy to fix once you hear it. When you're just getting started with jazz, it's technically demanding to figure out what scales work and how to play the arpeggios of a song, but that makes it even more frustrating if you have all of that under control and your solos still don't work at all. Let's start with the one that might require the most work, but that will also really help you level up how your solo sounds. Then I can show you some phrasing strategies, which borrow advice from Barry Harris. But first, see if you can hear what the problem is with this solo on the first few bars of All of Me. It's not what notes I'm playing. In this example, the notes are fine. The problem is with the melody and the flow. And this is something that I often help students fix in my course, The Jazz Guitar Roadmap. You need to develop one of the most important skills when it comes to playing music. And when you're learning to play jazz and improvise over chord changes, you're probably still in the process of learning the arpeggios, so C major 7 and E7, and finding the right notes. And that means that when you're soloing, you still have to spend a lot of energy on what to play on each chord and not how your phrases sound and how well they fit together. Often that means that you're playing phrases per chord. So C major 7 comes along and then you play a phrase over that. You stop and then you wait so that you have time to think about the next chord. And when the chord changes, then you play a phrase on that chord, in this case the E7. Again you stop and then you wait for the next chord change. There are a few problems with this. Your solos become boring and predictable because they start in the same place every time. There's no energy that sort of helps the music flow forward, because when something changes, you're kind of waiting for it to happen and then you play something. And like this, it's impossible to connect phrases across chords and tell a story with your solo. The important skill that I'm talking about is thinking ahead, and you want your solo to flow from chord to chord, which is actually not as complicated to learn as you might think. Let's look at how to get that forward motion and bebop flow in there. Now, if you're looking at the beginning of All of Me, you can start by practicing C major 7 lines, not only worrying about what fits that chord, but also making sure to end on E7. And this is where you need to think ahead. And instead of thinking of all the notes that you can play on E7 or all the chord tones of that chord, it's much more practical to just take one note at a time and practice playing towards that. Now, in this case, I'm using the G sharp, the third of E7, for two reasons. That note is very clear as a part of E7, as a part of that sound, and it is also not there over the C major 7, which really makes it stick out even more and make it easier to hear. You can turn this into a three-step process. Step 1, find one G sharp, one place on the neck. Keep it simple so you don't confuse yourself, and remember that this is more about learning to hear the melodic flow than it's about learning to play towards all G sharp notes on the neck. Step 2, start composing short and simple lines on C major 7 that end on that G sharp. For now, I want you to make the transition to the G sharp stepwise to make it as smooth as possible. Something like this. You can gradually make the lines longer and more complicated. And even start to add chromatic passing notes as well. Just explore what you can come up with. After doing this for a bit, to the point where you have made some lines that use C major 7 material that really flow to the E7, you can start applying this to the song. Now, you probably want to first also explore this for a few other chords as well, but that process actually gets a lot easier along the way. Check out this example. As you repeat this process on other chords, you will naturally get used to soloing like this without having to find specific target notes in advance. Let's talk about a few other common phrasing mistakes that are much easier to fix. Most students who are getting into jazz come from rock, metal or blues, but one aspect of those styles when it comes to soloing is sort of a bad habit in jazz. This has to do with jazz being more focused on rhythm and locking in with the groove, not only playing on top of it. Try to listen to this example, then I'll show you what the problem is and an easy way to practice towards fixing it. The problem with this solo is that all the phrases end on long notes. A long note has less rhythm than a short note because the short note has a clear beginning and a clear ending, and both are related to the rhythm. Now, in fairness, most good rock and blues solos will of course also vary this and not only end on long notes, even if some of the most famous rock solos rely a lot more on long notes. In jazz, there's much more tradition for ending phrases on short notes, and even if you never thought about it, then that is something you can hear in a lot of songs, like Tenor Madness. And of course also in solos. Try to listen to Wes Montgomery play here, there are very few long notes in there. Of course, I could give you thousands of examples of this, but if you listen to some of your favorite jazz solos and pay attention to this, then that might be even better and get you closer to fixing this. Keep in mind that I don't want to set up a rule that you always end on a short note. That's not how it works, but I do want you to be able to control and make choices about the length of the notes that you play. The length of the note is as important as dynamics in solos. It's a part of the music. This exercise is one of the most painful and one of the most helpful exercises that I know. Start recording your solos and then listen to them.
You are out of your mind!
With this topic in mind, you of course want to focus on how you end phrases and not get distracted by other things in your solo. That can be difficult, but you do need to focus on the specific things that you are trying to improve, and getting distracted by other aspects like timing, note choice, or whatever you're listening for is not going to help you do that. Now, if you realize that you always just let notes ring at the end of phrases, then you can practice soloing and pay attention to always ending on short notes. Over time, you will start to gain control of how you use note length, and it will become a part of your musical vocabulary. But even ending your phrases on a short note, you might run into another problem. In a way, fixing the two other mistakes I talked about in this video can cause this problem, but the solution will also help you work with an exercise to make your solo line sound 100 times better. If you play towards target notes and end on short notes, then your solo could still sound like this. As I already mentioned, jazz is about rhythm, and a part of the jazz language is syncopation and accents on the offbeats, which you don't have when you are ending all your phrases on a chord tone, on a downbeat with a short note, as I've just taught you. But let me show you two ways to fix that. First, I'll use a very simple but incredibly useful tactic, and then I'll add some Barry Harris tricks with his 5-4-3-2 licks, and give you an example of George Benson using two of them in one line. The first way to deal with this is to build the habit of not ending on the downbeat and always ending with a short tail of a few notes. The easiest way to start with that is to add another chord tone after the target note, which is in fact also why this music is called bebop. Take a simple phrase like this. All you need to do is add another chord tone after the resolution to E on the C major 7. The root will work. But the fifth also sounds great. And you can also skip up to the root an octave higher. And those two notes at the end of the phrase are really what gives the style its name, bebop, because that's a description of the phrasing and the dense syncopated lines that are typical for this style of music. You practice this by first composing lines that have this type of ending and then gradually incorporating that into solos, starting to get it to work as a natural part of your playing. Now, expanding on this very simple solution, you can also incorporate complete phrases instead of just adding a single note. And I like to use a set of phrases that I learned from Barry Harris. These 4 phrases often appeared in the Barry Harris masterclasses, and you can use them as building blocks. They're almost like bebop Legos. They work well for this, but are actually useful in general, and you can find them in a lot of solos. I'll show you a George Benson example in a bit. The first phrase is all diatonic, but also has some really nice melodic skips. This is what Barry would call 5, and you also have 4, which is a very nice chromatic enclosure. And of course, anything related to Barry Harris and bebop must have a pivot arpeggio and an arpeggio from the third of the chord. So 3 is an E minor 7 pivot arpeggio over a C major 7. And 2 other important bebop ingredients are chromatic passing notes, and eighth note triplets. And that is what you have in 2. But as you probably noticed, these are still ending on the heavy beats, which needs some attention. Another important thing is that the phrases are very flexible and can be used on different chords. George Benson uses the first phrase, which is called 5, on the dominant and resolves that to 3 in this example from his solo on Billy's Bounce. And here you also see how Benson adds an extra note after the 3 phrase to not end on the downbeat. And just like George Benson, you can add notes after the phrase. Here's an example with 5. And you can substitute the 5 phrase with 4 pretty easily, and then you get something like this. And with a different G7 line, then 3 fits perfectly. And here I just ended a bit earlier, which also sometimes works. And check out how great this chromatic phrase sounds. Now, another part of bebop that you want to explore to improve your solos is adding chromatic passing notes. And as you'll see in this video, Barry Harris has an amazing system for this. It has the right phrasing built in, and this system can transform your playing on several levels, and is a great place to add more bebop sound to your playing. Not only chromatic notes, but also phrasing. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.